So today I have the very distinct honor of introducing our lecturer today, Dr. Felicity Harley-McGowan of Yale Divinity School. She is a lecturer in art history at Yale Divinity School, focusing on the origin and development of Christian iconography in Roman visual culture in late antiquity, specifically focusing on representations of violence.
Thank you, Julian. I will go ahead and share the screen. So is that good to go?
Yep, looks great.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, I'm deeply honored to be here as your lecturer today, and grateful for the invitation to be able to share some of this work with you. Early one morning a few months ago, when I was in the Yale University Art Gallery in a small room, I heard from behind the sounds of a group approaching, a school teacher with a class of young children. The teacher began to speak, but on entering the space I was in, one of her pupils cried out, "Look, it's Jesus, it's Jesus." And I turned around to see a young child pointing to this painting, which there we are. This painting by Annibale Carracci. This representation of Jesus crucified is a beautiful example of the interest Carracci and his older brother Agostino showed in reasserting the study of nature in their artistic training in Bologna in the late 16th century. Here, Carracci inserts the cross into a landscape, but beyond vegetation and the texture of the craggy rock formations, his careful observation of nature is witnessed in his understanding and subtle use of light and shadow. It enables him to sensitively model the form of Jesus' body as it hangs, and to bring depth and movement to the folds of the loincloth. And it allows him to suggest both the divine and human natures of Jesus as the Son of the Christian God. On the one hand, Jesus' skin has a deathly pallor and is stained by tiny streaks of blood running from the wound in his side, from the nails in his hands and feet, and from the crown encircling his head where the thorns prick his skin. And note also that the hair is dark and dank, I should say, and lifeless. On the other hand, golden light is shown radiating from his body, from behind his head, to indicate his divinity. So this duality is echoed within the landscape, darkness and an overcast sky contrasted in the lifting of the clouds to reveal light on the horizon. To understand what the study of nature brings to this body of Jesus and to this interpretation of his death, we can turn to another, painted in the style known as mannerism, which artists such as Bronzino in Florence had been exploring in other centers of Italy in the preceding decades of the 16th century. Bronzino, with a meticulous drawing technique, worked with live models, but there is an academic dimension in his use of light in this representation of Jesus' body, and his crucified flesh achieves different ends. On this panel, commissioned for the high altar of a private chapel, light and shadow is part of his remarkable study of perspective, of the figure, and even of the cross. Note here the attention to the grain of the wood. This is almost a hyper-realistic representation. Crisp light enhances and shows off the anatomical precision of the body, which is set against the cold grey but exquisitely symmetrical architectural backdrop. There is no blood staining the luminous surface of this flesh. and strands of the golden hair here catch the light as curls fall decorously in rivulets around his chest. And the halo or nimbus is not a sensation of light emanating from the body, but is a perfectly formed golden disc placed above it, reflecting light. Bronzino's attention to detail was likely supported in his close study of images circulating in print. Here, an écorché or flayed figure, the skin removed to expose the musculature. This aids the accuracy in representing the effects on the anatomy of suspending a body from a cross. Carracci uses the same formula, one that we find almost infinitely repeated with minor variations across the history of art. And as the child that I encountered in the gallery attests, this is the formula by which Jesus is widely recognized. But just as Jesus is identified by his crucified body, it is also true that crucifixion as a method of execution in antiquity has come to be defined by the death of Jesus. And this presents some problems for us in examining the history of early Christian art and the place, or not, occupied by Jesus' execution in the early Christian imagination. Theology plays a key role in examining the art, if you like, and the potential role played by the earliest images of crucifixion. However, in what follows, I will focus on literary and visual sources for the Roman practice of crucifixion. That is the imagined art, if you like, of this torture, in order to enflesh our understanding of the ways that an image of Jesus executed came to be created. I'll begin with a modern definition of crucifixion, then give a brief overview of the earliest surviving images in late antiquity, and then drawing on recent studies of ancient literary sources, I will turn to look at some ways a closer understanding of ancient sources for the practice of crucifixion as a penalty may prompt us to adjust our approach to the history of the image of Jesus crucified. In the modern imagination, crucifixion constitutes a highly specific method of execution. That is the fatal suspension of a living victim from a cross-shaped scaffold. This narrow definition is conveyed linguistically by the English word from the Latin to fasten to a cross, and its equivalents in a variety of modern languages. And it is sustained and reinforced by the remarkably stable iconography of Jesus' execution that was formulated by the 5th century and circulated widely. Over time, artists have gone to extraordinary lengths to both adhere to the model and ensure its accuracy. An extreme case is that of 3 artists at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, who in 1801, with the assistance of a surgeon, crucified and flayed the cadaver of a freshly executed criminal, James Legge, in order to study the effects on his body, since they believed all artistic representations of crucifixion to be inaccurate. In fact, in the écorché figure that they produced, the result is very similar to what was already known by the 16th century. A less dramatic way to explore the physical impact of crucifixion was the use of live models. As Antonio Bianchini documents in Rome a century later, and here you'll note that alongside the live model in this class is an écorché figure in the top left-hand corner, reminding us, of course, of the recommendation by the Renaissance theorist Leon Battista Alberti that when painters intend to depict a nude, they should first arrange the muscles and the bones and then depict the overlying skin. Whether sculpted or drawn, the fact that this image remains almost universally recognizable enables artists to manipulate it in order to make social or political comments about the contemporary world. We recognize when crucifixion, when Jesus' posture is taken by someone else, for example, and the cross substituted by another object, in this case, the Volkswagen or the people's car. And even when the body is mutilated and the cross is absent, the torso, the curvature that we have here, and the loincloth are sufficient to evoke the whole picture in our mind, to recognize crucifixion and to know that this is Jesus. Yet, what do we really know about the early history of this image? Although the death of Jesus forms a focus for Christian preaching from the outset, and a distinctively Christian art begins to emerge around 200 AD in communities dispersed across the Mediterranean, there seems to have been very little interest in illustrating the fact or means of his death. In context, this is not as unusual as it seems. The artistic record attests that Christians were intently focused on images of deliverance from suffering, death, or on resurrection. They were not interested and not focused on moments of death. The three Hebrews in the fiery furnace, or Jonah disgorged from the whale, or Lazarus, as we have here, are all cases in point and should furnish the context for appreciating the rarity of images showing Jesus crucified prior to the 5th century. Even the earliest depictions, which are difficult to date, may seem to focus on the triumph of the crucified and not the actual process of the torture. And yet in doing so, their appearance, according to our modern eyes, is unusual, and consequently their authenticity is often questioned. In this example of an engraved gem, Jesus is named in an inscription at the top of the gem. So we know this is clear, this is Jesus. And he is distinguished by his size and his unequivocal nudity. He stands boldly upright against, rather than hanging from, a tau or T-shaped cross, and his wrists are clearly intended to be affixed or tied to it. And the diminutively sized and clothed 12 apostles walk towards him in a composition that seems to have no relationship to the gospel passion narratives. In a second example, the composition is repeated with some changes. So Jesus is again named quite clearly, but he's now elevated above the apostles who venerate him. He has the posture here, very emphatic, of one crucified, but there is no cross. And he now has the nimbus to assert his divine authority, or to underline, if you like, his divinity. The iconography, unusual relative to what we expect, is in complete accordance with contemporary interests and later developments, as found expressed by early Christians in a variety of media in the 4th and into the 5th centuries, in which the victorious cross and person of Jesus is venerated by the apostles. The wreath on this sarcophagus originally contained a monogram of Jesus' name, as we see in the case of this sarcophagus, where the Chi Rho at the center here, the first two letters of Christos were elevated and contained within this triumphal victory wreath suspended over the cross. The first two letters of Christos here are a prominent call to the identity, not just of the victim of the hanging, or who was crucified on the cross, but, as I said, of Jesus himself. And we must understand then that the figure that we see on the gemstones is a substitution for this figural type, without really changing the meaning of the scene of the veneration of the apostles. And on this fragment, where stars are clearly preserved, and as they are in other contexts, we have an indication that the veneration of these apostles is understood to take place in heaven, where the apostles themselves receive their own crowns of victory. This iconography, as it is experimented with on our gems, also seems to track with what we know had already developed by the 4th century. From other pictorial contexts, it is clear that a T or tau-shaped cross was often associated with the crucifixion, and I'll come back to this again towards the end. A graffito from southern Italy is a case in point. The structure, this tau cross, is also found on this magical amulet, where Jesus is shown crucified naked, bearded, and again clearly named in the inscription. It is also found on this roughly contemporary graffito from Rome. Alexamenos is worshipping his god here, as the inscription states, and like Chris Burden being nailed to a Volkswagen Beetle, I think we should understand here that for any social commentary or joke to be made about Alexamenos and his belief in the Christian God, for the parody to work here, the viewer had to be familiar with the original image that was being manipulated. And as we know more generally about Roman graffiti, images are not usually experimental. They adhere to pictorial conventions in order to communicate effectively and directly. So although the evidence for the representation of Jesus crucified is scant before the 5th century, there are important points of connection here. In addition to early knowledge of how to suspend someone tied to a scaffold, the images indicate an overriding interest in asserting Jesus' identity through inscription, as well as pictorial devices such as scale, posture, in one case the nimbus, and also emphasizing, or in the case of this graffito, parodying his authority. On the gems, that authority is enforced by placing him between the apostles. By the 5th century, Jesus is still shown on a T cross with a nimbus, and now details from the gospel narrative identify him. We have individual figures, Mary and the disciple John, as well as nails mentioned in the Gospels, and of course the inscription here, Jesus as King of the Jews. But you'll note, of course, that Jesus is alive here, as he is in the single other case of an image of Jesus crucified from the 5th century. Let me now turn to Roman sources to help illuminate this iconography, which, although in part is familiar, also has some rather curious features. The origins of crucifixion as a penalty are difficult to trace, and it is unclear how the Romans came to adopt and develop crucifixion as a form of execution. Sources attest that the Romans suspended people in large numbers during uprisings, and according to Seneca the Younger, the techniques were diverse. And in addition to the visual evidence I have shown, these sources furnish vital information for us in understanding a broader cultural context in which images such as this were desired, then designed, and produced. In Antiquity, there was no single word to designate crucifixion in the way that term is used and understood in a variety of modern languages today. This point is not new, although it has been the subject of exhaustive philological studies in the past 2 decades. It has been known since the 16th century, when the classical scholar Justus Lipsius authored the first history of crucifixion. Prior to this point, aspects of Jesus' cross had received attention from Catholic theologians, and the mechanics of crucifixion had been treated in explicit detail by the priest Antonio Galonio in the horrifying catalogue of torture methods he published in Rome in 1591. Drawing on Roman authors as well as Christian literature that included acts of martyrdom and patristic texts, Galonio's purpose was to systematically categorize methods of execution according to their mechanical features in order to investigate the tools that were used and the ways that martyrs were tortured. Full-page illustrations were a key part of this treatise. And crucifixion, which is letter C here in this image, appeared as one method within a much broader category of execution, a category that he termed suspension. And you note here that in presenting crucifixion, and in this case of a woman, not of Jesus, the artist Giovanni Guerra seems to have been familiar with ancient representations of Prometheus, suspended or crucified on a high rock, with the left leg bent and the knee facing frontally. And for the crucified woman, the knee here pushing directly out of the picture plane towards the viewer. So adapting here, I think, a well-known iconographic type that was copied in Roman art, and to which I'll return a little later in the lecture. Despite this work on the cross and Galonio's work on torture methods, a sustained and objective treatment of crucifixion in its ancient historical context had not been attempted. Lipsius, celebrated across Europe for his knowledge of ancient authors, was in a very good position to undertake this task. He had already undertaken various treatises on aspects of Roman civilization, including architecture, gladiatorial games, and the Roman amphitheatre. And it was in the humanist tradition of philology that his aim in the treatise on the cross was to assemble the evidence for crucifixion in antiquity in the context of Roman law and society, but not to interpret it, although at times he struggles in this aim. For him, the death of Jesus was relevant as a case study to illuminate rather than to define what was known about crucifixion. So Jesus' death allowed exploration of the main questions underlying the structure of the treatise. And these were: what was the cross? What was it like? Where, why, how, and up to what time was it used as a method of execution? Like Galonio, Lipsius included images as a way of crystallizing technique, cataloging and illustrating methods that were infinitely repeatable, like a recipe book. And like Galonio, he did not illustrate the death of Jesus. He did note that the terminology for crucifixion was flexible, even ambiguous. The Greek word stauros and the Latin word crux did not uniquely mean a cross, as in an upright wooden beam to which was added a horizontal bar to form a cruciform or T-shaped structure. And there are many sources that illustrate this ambiguity, and I want to look at just one example. The account by the poet Martial of the staging in 80 AD in Rome of the popular mime about the slave-turned criminal Laureolus. The climax of this mime was the death of Laureolus, and in the performance Martial witnessed, it was a live execution. A criminal being cast in the role of Laureolus and executed on the stage from a real cross before being fatally mauled by a bear. And here is the text. Laureolus, hanging from no false cross, gave up his defenceless entrails to a Scottish bear. His mangled limbs were still alive, though the parts were dripping with blood, and in his whole body there actually was no body. In our modern understanding of crucifixion, the death of Laureolus on no false cross is easy for us to visualize. And yet, Marshall does not provide any specific information about the scaffold, the crooks, or the method used to affix Laureolus to it, even though he takes some delight in describing in detail the bloody process. Could the scaffold have looked something like this? A pole against which the victim becomes an easy target for a bear. A similar lack of interest in these details, which are fundamental to the modern definition of crucifixion, is betrayed in an earlier account of the mime by Josephus, where Laureolus is simply described as crucified, as though the reader knew exactly what this entailed, and so supplied the particulars from their imagination or from their memory, just as we did in the case of this sculpture. In seeking to recover ancient understandings of crucifixion and arrive at a workable definition, over the last roughly 2 decades, David Chapman, John Cook, and Gunnar Samuelson have searched for descriptions of or references to crucifixion in a wide range of ancient literary sources in a variety of languages, from legal documents to biblical texts, graffiti, and even extant records of dream interpretation. While they do not always agree in their interpretation of these texts, and some choose to focus on certain texts and some on others, they all observe that the sources indicate the use of a broad semantic field to describe a range of punishments involving suspension, including impalement of a corpse or of a live victim, ante-mortem suspensions, but also post-mortem suspension for display. So the range of texts together reveal a linguistic fluidity. Punishments that we now regard as distinct are not clearly differentiated, and terms for execution by suspension over against terms used for suspension and display of a corpse were often conflated. And in addition to this fluidity, there is a general lack of interest in the precise shape of a suspension device, whether it's a single vertical pole or one that's intersected by a horizontal bar to form a cross, in inverted commas. Shape is rarely mentioned or described by ancient writers. So, as I've mentioned, the terms crux in Latin or stauros in Greek were themselves ambiguous. They could refer to an upright post, not necessarily the cross-shaped device we assume, unless there are clear contextual indicators to suggest otherwise. All of this means that it is difficult to discern the precise nature of punishments carried out by Romans. Anthropological and archaeological evidence is of little help here. There are only a very small number of possible cases of Roman crucifixion in the archaeological record. The clearest may be the skeleton excavated most recently in Cambridgeshire in 2017 of a man perhaps aged between 25 or 35 with an iron nail found in his heel bone. This bone was in better condition than the well-known but more fragmentary heel from a Jewish tomb excavated in Israel in 1968, which has a nail in the same position. Opinions have varied as to how the heel bone was positioned on the vertical shaft and nailed to it. reflecting some of our, modern preoccupations about the specificity of the carrying out of crucifixion as a repeatable process. But this archaeological evidence can be situated alongside the visual evidence to begin to build a richer picture of methods, even if that picture is slightly sketchy. And this evidence underscores what we have begun to know, that is, practices could vary, particularly in the affixation of feet, which could be nailed or tied, or even the legs split apart to hang loosely. Of course, each of the 4 canonical Christian Gospels contain accounts of Jesus' death, and although rudimentary at best, they are largely uniform regarding details, and so they illuminate what we know about the practice. As the single most comprehensively documented extant record of an execution by this method in the ancient world, the Gospels can constitute our most helpful sources of evidence for the carrying out of a crucifixion in Roman antiquity. Reading the history of crucifixion in general through the lens of Christian history and Christ's crucifixion has thus become almost unavoidable. And despite Lipsius's own best efforts, the process of the trial, carrying of the cross, stripping, flagellation, verbal abuse, and nailing of Jesus are now routinely upheld or presented as the norm, rather than as a case study of Roman crucifixion, with the gospel accounts interrogated as descriptions of an historical event. Given that those accounts also constitute the earliest theological interpretations of that event, it is necessary to proceed with some caution in evaluating the historical versus theological contributions they make to the understanding of the practice. From his own philological analyses of ancient sources, John Cook has concluded that there was some standardization in Roman techniques of execution by suspension, and that the death of Jesus, according to the accounts in the Gospels, is helpful in teasing these out, as Lipsius himself aimed to show. Cook comes to a number of conclusions about the practice of crucifixion per se, but instead of recounting them all, I want to highlight just a few here. That victims were often walked in chains to their place of execution, a place that was frequently designated outside the city. They might be patibulated, and here we have some crazy versions of which Lipsius illustrated, but patibulating meaning that the victim carried the horizontal part of their cross to the place of execution, where the vertical beam would already be in place. Victims could be stripped, but this did not necessarily mean that they were naked, as we understand and use that term today. Ropes or nails, or perhaps both, could be used to affix the victim to their instrument of torture. They could be attached upright or in different poses, such as upside down. The magistrate would read the charge from a placard, an example of which we have here in this sculpture that is carried by a prisoner. The charge written on a placard or perhaps on a titulus, and then this could in turn be placed onto the cross. And finally, bodies could rot on crosses, or they could be buried, as in the case of Jesus, and also in the case of the crucified skeleton from Cambridgeshire. Given the rather egregious myths and assumptions that are perpetuated in so many discussions of Jesus' death, particularly regarding the carrying of the cross as a whole Latin-shaped structure, and the persistent emphasis on nails and complete nudity as universal norms for Roman crucifixion, The fundamental details that Cook has established and the clarity he thereby attains has, in conjunction with the work of his colleagues Chapman and Samuelson, important implications for our understanding both of the perception of crucifixion in antiquity and how the death of Jesus was understood among nascent Christian communities. And I should like to highlight just two implications that their work collectively has. Firstly, the case of how we translate cross, and secondly, some broader issues of torture and violence in antiquity. As I've already noted, the three scholars have established that in antiquity, sources in a variety of languages demonstrate a general lack of interest in specifying the shape of suspension devices, and that without a clear description or contextual indicators, it is not always apparent to what such words as crux, stauros, and their cognates refer, and Marshall's epigram illustrates this. So while a cross-shaped scaffold may have been the norm in the Roman era, this was not the only shape to be designated by those words. While it might be possible to speak of a general method of Roman crucifixion, this was just one of many variations on execution by suspension, as Gallonio already understood. As a result, when a Greek-speaking audience, for instance, heard terminology relating to stauros, a broader range of concepts around bodily suspension likely came to mind. David Chapman thus concludes, and I'm very much persuaded by this, that generally in antiquity, the form of penal bodily suspension was less significant than the fact that the body was suspended. This fact undermines long-held beliefs about what the cross was in antiquity, and so has profound implications for traditional narratives about the death of Jesus and early Christian responses to it. For example, when we find instances of abuse scratched in graffiti, for instance, in Crucifixion, get nailed to a cross, as found in Pompeii, or instances of abuse spoken on stage, such as in Malem Crucem, get to the cross. For an individual, the obscenities may have referred to the general concept of suspension, and perhaps, as some translators believe, to notions of evil, rather than evoking a specifically cruciform suspension device, as is so often assumed. If this is the case, the widely held modern belief that cross-shaped symbols in late antiquity carried a specific kind of shame and uniformly shameful, and as such were avoided by early Christians as references to the mode of Jesus' death, this assumption has little support. In fact, from his own analysis of the literary sources, Gunnar Samuelson has concluded that the idea of a cross as a consistently shaped instrument of torture, and so as a symbol of suffering, did not exist prior to the crucifixion of Jesus, but that after his death, as they sought to understand its significance, Christians brought a very particular understanding about shape to that word. In other words, perhaps we might think that Christians did not so much avoid, but actually actively fashioned the idea of the cross, such as we understand it today. In two graffiti of crucifixion from the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries that we saw earlier, the tool on which the victims hang has, in both cases, a patibulum to form a T-shaped cross, a correspondence that supports the contention that there was some, but not absolute, standardization of practice with regard to crucifixion. This contention receives further support in the representation of Jesus' crucifixion on the amulet that we saw, which may date as early as around 200 AD and depicts Jesus here tied at the wrists to the cross. Moreover, several writers, both Christian and non-Christian, witness to the identification of Stauros with a T-shaped structure, including the author of the Epistle of Barnabas and Lucian of Samosata in the 2nd century. And by the time of Tertullian in Carthage, around roughly 160 to 240, it is clear that many believed the cross of Jesus to have been T-shaped. The use of the staurogram in gospel texts at the word cross and crucify, perhaps by around 200 AD, but certainly by the 4th century, as Brent Nongbury has convincingly argued for the dating of these papyri. This usage supports the idea that Christians understood Jesus' cross to have a specific form. So the question of the use or not of cross-shaped symbols to refer to the death of Jesus may be one not so much of avoidance of a symbol with fixed shape and association, i.e. with crucifixion, but of deliberate cultivation of and experimentation with a symbolism to refer explicitly to Jesus' death, where previously there was fluidity. Another implication of a more nuanced understanding of Roman crucifixion as one in a spectrum of executions and its impact on visual representation is the opening of a new set of possibilities for the study of torture and violence in the late ancient world. In a confident implementation of the broad definition of crucifixion as one in a larger category of suspension techniques, Sean Anthony has examined the prevalence of crucifixion in the Umayyad Empire, the first caliphal dynasty of early Islam. In so doing, he brought Islamic sources to sit alongside Greco-Roman, Jewish, and Christian sources to further widen the historical focus. His claim that the Umayyad dynasty and its political fate were closely bound to the institution of crucifixion is provocative, not so much for what it says about the dynasty and its tactical and widespread use of this punitive institution, but for the claim he subsequently makes about the history of crucifixion per se. For while the origins of the practice and the point at which Romans developed it remain unclear, when the practice ended is also open to debate. Indeed, beyond questions around whether Constantine successfully abolished crucifixion in the 4th century or not, Anthony posits a lively post-Roman continuation of the penalty in the Umayyads. While this thesis affects a welcome undoing of the traditional tethering of crucifixion history to the Greco-Roman world and to Christianity specifically, it also complicates the highly circumscribed view of Roman crucifixion as a clearly defined technique from which Islamic usage radically departs. In sum, therefore, the questions first raised by Lipsius in 1594 about what the cross was, where, why, how, and up to what time it was used as a method of execution remain relevant, even if the methods of addressing them have now shifted. I want to end by returning us to Laureolus. Although Marshall does not specify the shape of the suspension tool, the literary context provides a clue as to what the real, non-falsa, execution structure the cross may have looked like. Just as Prometheus, chained on a Scythian crag, fed the tireless bird on his prolific breast, so Laureolus, hanging on no false cross, gave up his defenseless entrails. As John Cook has emphasized, in likening Laureolus's suspension and torture to that of Prometheus, Marshall triggers for the contemporary reader or hearer associations relating not just to the Titan, but to a set of heroes and heroines who were affixed to their place of suffering, tethered at the wrists of their outstretched arms and sometimes their feet. And this is pivotal for our understanding of the ways artists may have approached the subject of the Son of the Christian God, suspended from a scaffold. Prometheus, who in creating humans out of clay had his own very particular association with and understanding of human anatomy, was tethered for eternity to a rock as punishment by Zeus for stealing fire from Olympus and giving it to mankind. The position, which enabled an eagle to feed from his liver, was the subject of a long iconographic tradition. Naked, his arms outstretched and affixed to the rocks at the wrists, his body thereby exposed. And here, that exposed body parodied not only in the caricatured face in many respects, which also correlates later with parody that we find in ancient graffiti, but also with his enormous phallus that is shown here. In some cases, Prometheus is shown with his ankles tied as well as the wrists. And just give you both a broader view of this particular object. Historically, such exposure relates to a penalty in ancient Greece that provides the foundation on which suspensions and crucifixion as a broadly conceived method of execution were developed. Shortly after Martial wrote his epigram, the Greek satirist and rhetorician Lucian, who was born in around 120 AD, in describing the torture of Prometheus, employed Greek suspension terminology to present the way that the Titan was pinned to his place of torture, describing a cross-shaped suspension position with arms outstretched. And Lucian also refers to other features associated with this execution, and which of course come to be associated with Jesus' death, including its public and prolonged character. Martial's audience would have been familiar with the iconography, which was well established and, as I've mentioned, widely circulated in Rome. This is just one example. And a century ago, Orazio Marucci observed that there were iconographic similarities between Prometheus and Andromeda, who is bound here to her own rock and suspended in punishment. And to this pair, I could add other figures, including Ixion, condemned to be tied to an eternally rotating wheel, and even Marsyas. Hence, although Martial does not describe the shape of the cross, it is his evocation of the image of Prometheus, very vivid image that enables for the ancient reader a clear picturing of Laureolus suspended with arms outstretched. And suspended meaning not necessarily hanging, but the feet perhaps on the ground. Martial's epigram is thus a helpful test case for closure of the gap between modern and ancient perceptions of the penalty of crucifixion. For if we embrace a definition of crucifixion that is closer to the ancient understanding, and so situate that penalty within a broader conceptual category of suspension, we are, I think, better able to understand images such as this, and subsequently this, not as wild cards, but as part of a careful exploration of who Jesus was. At this early stage, the image still remains open and able to accommodate contemporary theological concerns regarding the two natures of Jesus, which I mentioned at the beginning, the divine and the human. Which of these natures suffered on the cross? This was a huge problem that was debated and therefore enormously problematic for artists. But that is a subject for a different lecture. And for the set of evidence that I have briefly exposed here, it is enough to conclude that for the early Christian viewer in Rome, this was very definitely Jesus, represented according to an understanding of execution by suspension with which they were familiar, and to a definition of crucifixion that they were actively crafting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Let's see. There we are. Okay, perfect. So this was a really, really fascinating talk, and I personally have a number of questions that I want to ask. And so without further ado, I'm just going to actually jump right in. One of the things that you kind of mentioned here, you cited a scholar named Samuelson, and I think the theory that this individual espoused was that the cross wasn't seen as a method of torture, but rather after the advent of Christianity itself, the definition of a cross was slowly forged, right? And based on this theory, I just kind of want you to walk with me right quick on this. There are kind of three elements that you had shown throughout this presentation. We see the element of iconography, we see the element of inscription, and one that I'm not sure we talked too much about, but we also see this element of materiality kind of at play as we look through the centuries. And I really wanted to focus on the question of iconography and materiality, right? So how did Christians, using the materials that they did in forging something like amulets or other kind of apotrope or healing type materials, choose to kind of take this concept that was tied to something that wasn't necessarily related to healing itself in its instantiation? Does that make sense?
Can you say a little more about the tying? Yeah.
It's the concept of the cross, it seems, didn't really kind of receive a robust definition until after the advent of Christianity. So
right.
How did the materiality and iconography play through materiality to kind of achieve that, right? Because when we looked at a number of the objects that you presented, they were across a different set of material. And so if you talk a little bit more about that relationship.
Well, I think this is probably one of the challenges because the material is so disparate. So, and I think this is one of the problems that I faced many years ago when I began to work on this material, that if you were to conduct an art historical study of this material, then certain pieces of evidence wouldn't make the grade, as it were. So graffiti, which has only, in more recent years been given a closer attention and enfolded into a broader understanding of material culture. And similarly with engraved gems and amulets. So when some of these objects first began to be published, they were published by individuals who were collectors or people who were interested in gems themselves. But those objects themselves were not then necessarily incorporated into a broader narrative about the history of the image. So there was a disconnect in many ways. These pieces of evidence free floating about the visual representation that weren't being brought together in order to address some of the questions, if I understand you correctly, of the ways in which different individuals may respond materially to the subject of the death of Christ. And so amulets, for instance, give us an important insight, even if we are not there. Not everyone agrees with my more positive interpretation of that magical amulet. Some people think it's quite a highlights the violence of crucifixion in very particular ways. But what we see in the amulet, at least, is the desire to draw on the understanding of Jesus as a powerful individual, and the understanding there, which may not necessarily be linked directly to Christianity. This may be an amulet used by a person that was not necessarily a follower, but the understanding that this son of a god was executed in this way, but then was resurrected. So somehow that was he was a powerful individual in overcoming that death. So the object onto which an invocation is inscribed and the image is engraved, it becomes a very personal element of faith, maybe in the power of the divine. So the role of the iconography is different in that context from a very intimate context of graffiti, where someone is actively inscribing a wall for someone to then very actively engage with, which may have something more to do, not necessarily with an apotropaic or personal desire for encounter with the divine, but a commentary or a parody on that. So I think that one of the interesting aspects of the set of evidence is one of the most difficult aspects, in that it's so disparate, that it indicates that in different sectors of personal life, as well as in the broader social sphere, there was thought and cogitation about, not just within Christian communities, about the death of Jesus, but what the death of that individual meant.
Yeah, perfect. And just since we're on the note of the amulet, and this will probably be time for our last question. I was kind of curious. Could you tell me, it's often dated to around 200 CE. How kind of well supported is this? And are we kind of sure it's pre-Constantinian? Yeah, if you could speak a little bit more about that.
Sure. The magical amulet.
Yes.
Yeah.
The blood.
So it's dated alongside quite a large corpus of Greco-Roman magical amulets that share a number of physical characteristics in terms of their size, as well as different materials that are used for their construction, and different properties in terms of the ways in which images interact with text, and the content of the texts is, in terms of this large body of amulets, studied alongside the content that we have in the Greco-Roman magical papyri. So that there are some overlaps that we find, or points of connection rather, in terms of naming particular divinities, in particular sequences of vowels or of letters that were meant to be vocalized. So it's a larger corpus in terms of both the papyri and the gems that can begin to provide some kind of time frame.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. We actually received a number of other questions. Would it be all right if some of the participants emailed them to you, if that's okay with you?
Yes,
Great.
sure.
Well, then thank you all for coming out. And again, thank you so much, Professor. This was really, really great.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.